What's up guys, and welcome back to another session in Reactive UI in Xamarin.Forms. Today we are going to talk about data binding. So let's get started. First of all, what is data binding in general? Actually, it's a very neat and gentle mechanism to make communication with data and UI. Basically, it's a channel between the app UI and the data it displays. When the data changes its value, the UI element that are bound to that data reflects that change automatically. Okay, let's explain this with more details. Let's imagine here I have the simple UI. I have a text box called entry in Xamarin.Forms and I have a label. Here I have a class called login_view_model and has a property called username. Here I bind the text property of this entry to this username using data binding. So whenever I write in this text box, automatically this property that I bound to get populated with the value of this text box of this entry, the text property in this entry. And here, whenever this property gets changed, this reflects to the text property of this label automatically in the UI. Okay, what is this here? What is this interface called INotifyPropertyChanged? Actually, it's a very simple interface that has this event called the property changed. Whenever this property changed, we invoke this event which reflects this change or notify the UI that there is some changes in the value of this property. So all the UI elements that are bound to this property will be notified and change the value of it automatically. Okay, everything gonna be more clear when we start writing code. But before, let me talk about the components of data binding. First, we have the binding context. What is binding context? Actually, when you bind to a property, like in the previous example, the username, this username should be a property for an object. So the object there in that example is an object of the class login_view_model. So this is the binding context that contains the property we want to bind to. The second thing is the source property. What is the main property or the source of the binding, which is in the previous example the username property, and a target property, the property that will be affected, which is in the previous example the text property of the entry. Okay, now let me talk about the modes of data binding. Actually, data binding has two modes. The first one called one-way data binding, from target property to source property. For example, when I change the username, the target property, which is the text property of the entry, will be changed. But when I write in the text box, when I change the text property in the entry, the target property, which is the username, won't be affected. This is the first mode of binding, and the second one is the two-way data binding. The name talks about itself. Here, when I change the target, the source gets affected, but the opposite as well. When I change the source, the target gets affected. Let me go a little bit to the previous example here. Actually, here I have two bindings. The first one is the entry to the username, the text property in the entry to the username, and the text of the label to the username. Here, binding is two-way. Whenever I change the text property here, this username will be changed. And whenever I change this, the text property will be affected. But here, the binding is one way. Only when I change this property, this will be affected. These are the modes of data binding. Now, we can bind also the controls to each other. Okay, let's move right now to the code and let's make a simple example. Let's remove this. I'm going to make two examples. The first one is bind a control to control. like I will create a slider and an entry, then I will bind the value property of the slider to the text property of the entry. So whenever I change the value of the slider, this will be affected in the text property of the entry. And the second example gonna be bind a text property to a property inside a view model. So let's get started. First, I'm going to create an entry and a slider, control to control binding example. Okay, slider, I'm gonna give it a name, call it slider, and minimum value 0, maximum value is 10. Okay, a little margin, and that's enough. Now I'm going to create an entry, giving it a margin, and that's it. Now I want to bind the text property of this entry to the value property of this slider. Okay, now simply I can use this syntax in XAML to binding. Say binding path, which is the property called value. Okay, now I have defined the property, but what about the binding context? Where is the object that has this property? Okay, now I can define binding context. This is gonna be an item inside the UI, so I can use the reference XAML extension to bind it. The name of the object is slider. So now, as you can see here, I have told this entry like the text property will be populated from the value property of this slider. Okay, the binding context, I just told the entry that the object that has this property is this slider, because maybe inside my application I have tons of objects, so where is the object I want to deal with exactly? I used binding context to set this object to this property, and then I made that data binding, which is the value property of this slider. Okay, now to define the mode, we can simply use this mode one way. Okay, which means only when I change the target, which is the value property inside the slider, the text property will be affected inside the entry, but not vice versa. Okay, let's start the application and see that in action. Here is my slider and here is the entry. As you can see, by default, the value of the entry is 0 because the value of the slider right now is just 0. Now, let me change this value. Okay, as you can see, automatically, whenever I change the value of the slider, the entry here will be affected automatically. That's pretty nice, right? Now I'm going to change the way and say the mode is two-way. And let's start that. Okay, now I have two-way data binding. So when I change the value of the slider, the text property in the entry is changing, but also if I change the value of the entry, this affects the value of the slider. As you can see, 6.7 immediately. Okay. This is the two modes of binding and bind control to control. Now I'm going to move to the second example, which is bind control to an object not in the UI. I'm going to call this a view model, which is the class that's responsible to the UI logic. Okay, and this is what MVVM is all about. Instead of writing this code in the code behind file of this page and write the logic only specifically to this page and specifically to this item that I have here, MVVM allows me to write a general logic dealing with normal C# objects like and variables such as string, integer, date, time, not a specific entry or slider. And then I can bind a page to that class, then I can control the UI logic. But that logic is not specifically to this UI, it could be to any UI. Maybe in Xamarin.Forms, Windows 10 UWP application, WPF, and etc. Okay, I'm going to comment this. Then I'm going to create a very simple class. I'm going to call it login view model, and that's it. Okay, cool. Now let's public, and now I'm going to create very basic property, string username, get using lambda expression, return username, set username equals to value. Okay. Now I need to create an object of type login view model and assign this object to the binding context of the page. By the way, when I set the binding context for the page, okay, which is the parent of all the controls inside it, when I bind any control inside this page to any property, the control are going to look for that property inside the binding context object for its parent. Okay, for example, if I set the binding context here to an object of login view model and here the entry, I can simply bind to the username property without defining the binding context anymore, and the entry automatically are going to look for that property inside the binding context of its parent. Okay, so let's see how we can do this in XAML without the need to write any C# code. Actually, by the way, I can bind that in the code. Like if I go to the code behind file, I can simply say binding context property of the page equals to new login view model. Okay, this is the way how I can bind that object to the page, but I prefer to do it in XAML. We can do this first by adding the reactive UI demo namespace, because the login view model is inside the reactive UI demo namespace. So we can do this in XAML by writing this, and I'm going to call it local equals to reactive UI demo. Okay, now inside the resources of the page, going to create a resource dictionary. Inside it, I'm going to create local login view model and give it a key. Let's call it login view model. This actually, when I open this page, this creates a new object, but I've defined that in XAML instead of code. Now I want to bind or set this object to the binding context property of this page. So I can go here for this page and let me say binding context equals to static resource, and let's give it the key, or I can write that directly, login view model, the key of the object I want to get its value. Okay, that's amazing. Now I'm going to uncomment this, and here I'm going to bind it to the username property, which is this one inside the login view model, username, mode 2A. By default, many controls, and entry is one of them, the default binding mode is 2-way for the text property. And there are some other properties, but I prefer to specify the mode this way and not to depend on if it is by default 2-way or 1-way. You specify it, and that's not gonna take any time and make it more clear. Okay, here I'm going to create a label, and the text of the label gonna be bind as well to the username property, but the mode is 2-way, 1-way, and here it is 1-way by default in the label. Find a margin 2-way. So now, whenever I change the value of this entry, this gonna reflects this value, but when I change this value by the text, by the entry, the text property, or maybe by any method that's existing here, I want this change to be reflected in the UI on this property. Okay, right now let's test this. Okay, now here is my entry. If I typed Ahmad Muzaffar, okay, nothing happened, and this the text property of the label didn't change. But let's set a breakpoint here inside the set to make sure that this value is getting changed. And let's type anything. Okay, that's nice. The value is Ahmed Muzaffar space. But why the label property didn't have the value of the username, which is Ahmed Muzaffar? Actually, that's because we need to implement a mechanism inside the view model to notify the UI, like, hey, username has been changed. So the UI then know that there is any change, and it should like make an update. Now, to implement that, we need to inherit from INotifyPropertyChanged interface, and it's already a built-in interface inside .NET. Okay, now this interface has this event. Whenever we change the value of a property that we want to notify the UI that this property has been changed, we need to fire this event. Okay, so simply when I set a new value, this means that the property has been changed, or we can say if value, the new one, not equals to username. This means the value has a new value rather than the old one. Okay, here we fire that event. We say property change dot invoke the sender, which is this, and the event args called the property changed event args takes the name of the property as a parameter. The name of the property is username. You can say it this way, or use the name of syntax, username, which is more safe. Okay. Now, when we set any value to the username, this notifies the UI that, hey, a new value has been set, you need to be updated. Let's start that again and see what happens. Okay, here we go. You see, whenever I set a new value here, this gets reflected automatically inside the label. pretty nice. In some special conditions, for example, when I bind for a property that has a different type, like if the value of the entry is, for example, blue, I want the text color property of the label set it to blue. So in this way, I'm binding a string property to a color property. In this situation, we need something called converters. I'm going to implement this. First, to do that, before I create the converter, I'm going to bind that to the property. I'm going to say binding to username. I can say path equals username or by default username. Okay, so you see here I bound a color property, a string property to a color property. So here we need a converter to translate this value into a color. How we can accomplish this? Simply, we go here and let's create a new folder. Let's call it converters. And I'm going to create a new class called string to color property. Converter, sorry. Okay. This property this class has to implement iValueConverter interface. This interface has two methods. The first one called convert and the second one called convert back. The convert, it takes a string and returns to the type color, and the convert back takes a color and return it as the string. Actually, in this way, the binding gonna be in one way. We don't need to set a color and this will reflect the username property. So simply I'm going to set here return null. But here it returns an object and receives an object called value. So first I'm going to say if value is not equals to null. This way return null simply. Here var text equals to value dot to string, because the value is string. I'm going to say if text equals to blue, then return a color dot blue. Else if, let's add red, return color dot red. Otherwise, other than that, let's return color dot purple. Okay, after we created the converter, we can go back to the UI and let's import the converter's namespace. XMLS, call it converters, equals converters. Okay. Now we can add this converter, an object of that converter, in the resource dictionary. Converters, string to color converter. Let's give it a key. String to color converter. Now, binding to the username, and I'm going to specify the converter. Let's say converter equals to static resource string to color converter. Now, when the view model notified the UI that hey, there is a new value for the username, it uses this converter, this object, it calls the string to color converter, give it the value of the username, check if it is blue, for example, it returns blue, which is valid for the property text color, and other than that, it returns null. Okay, let's start the application to check the result. Now let's type inside the text box. You see by default the converter, because the value of the username, it's not blue or not red, so it returns purple. If I type red, wow, this is gonna be red, and other than it's gonna be purple. If I type blue, wow. Okay. You can find the current source code of this project. Actually, during this course, I'm going only to work on this project for our examples, and you can find it on the GitHub. I'll put the link inside the description box below. You can check it. Starting from the next video, I'm going to talk about observables and start the real action with reactive UI and complete our journey with MVVM. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe and share. See you!